What I'm going to try and do today is just give you a bit of a very short introduction into some of the work we've been doing on sanctions related to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and a bit of an insight into some of the key issues that are in play here. So, the current UN sanctions regime, as Daniel pointed out, is aimed at stemming Iranian uranium enrichment and tackling its ballistics capabilities. Many states are anxious, to say the least, about nuclearized Iran, its implications for the NPT, and also, as Daniel pointed out, the risk of further proliferation in the wider Middle East region. With these aims in mind, there's been a number of UN resolutions and 4 increasingly stringent UN Security Council sanctions being put in place, with which, all in all, significantly curtail Iran's ability to import and export certain goods. As it stands today, states are prohibited from importing any arms or related material from Iran, or exporting any heavy conventional weaponry to Iran, and are obliged to prevent their nationals, flagged vessels and aircraft from engaging in such activity and helping Iran's nuclear ballistics programs. On top of that, you have EU sanctions, which also target trade relations and, crucially, Iran investment into Iran's energy sector, and also US sanctions, which have been in place to varying degrees since the hostage crisis. Added on to that, you also have a number of national unilateral sanctions put in place by various governments. All in all, this means that Iran is today subject to one of the most stringent sanctions regimes in terms of scale, depth, and, crucially, enforcement. Now, in terms of enforcement, Iran is actually one of the most interesting cases to look at. States dedicate a high amount of surveillance and intelligence onto Iran, and it's in many of their interests, the interests of navies who try and justify their existence, and other institutions to highlight how any sanctions invasions, which actually makes it very good for people like us looking at the mechanics behind illicit trafficking. Now, SIPRI has carried out extensive research into illicit trafficking via air, which I won't have time to get into today, but Iran has been accused of using all the almost now traditional techniques used to shift illicit cargo via aircraft. All of these kind of techniques have been used by militia, rebels, and sanctioned regimes across the world to conceal illicit transfers via aircraft. Having said that, when it comes to using aircraft for these purposes, there are a number of reasons, and this is particularly true for Iran, as to why this kind of activity can be quite effectively limited. For safety reasons, the aviation industry is one of the most heavily regulated in the world, meaning that all aircraft need to be registered, their movements filed and approved, and their cargo declared. When you've got aircraft who have to refuel in various foreign countries, their cargo capacity is actually relatively small, making it easier to search and harder to conceal goods, meaning that the provisions contained within these sanctions can actually make aircraft quite susceptible to detection. One of the main problems with Iran is the fact that it's surrounded by countries which have in the past used overflight permission and airspace to stop suspicious aircraft moving and transferring their goods. There's been numerous cases from as far afield as India and all the countries surrounding Iran showing how overflight permission can be used to stop suspicious aircraft. So if you look to the west of Iran, where various parties it is alleged to support militarily, so Hezbollah or Gaza, or places where it uses as a transshipment point, Sudan, you can see that it'd be hard for their aircraft to get there without being detected. There's also been 2 cases in Turkey, one in 2006 and one as recently as February, where overflight permission was used to search an aircraft, and in this case, in the one in February, an Illicit 76 headed for Syria was searched and found with rifles and ammunition on board and sent back to Tehran. The Revolutionary Guards do have their own fleet of transport aircraft as well, but in this case, a private Iranian carrier was used. So for this and these other reasons to the right there, agents looking to import and export illicit goods to Iran are actually likely better suited to use maritime vessels for doing so. And indeed, it's in ports and at sea where most cases of sanctions evasions have occurred. Now, the current provisions do try and pretty stringently tackle Iran's shipping industry, and especially its national shipping company, IRISL. What you tend to find, however, is that as a consequence of this, is that these vessels have used common shipping practices to try and evade effective enforcement. Where am I here? In August of last year, a vessel on board the Finland, a Liberian-flagged, Greek-operated, Swiss-run vessel, was found to contain explosives wrapped in milk powder and used Italy as a transshipment point for onwards diversion onto Syria. Again last year, 10 containers containing heavy weapon ammunition were found on board, offloaded from the Everest, a Marshall Islands flagged vessel, for transshipment again onto the Gambia. There have also been numerous cases of interdiction by military forces at sea on vessels actually in transit, and this typically happens in the Mediterranean or Red Sea by Israeli or American forces and on vessels ostensibly heading towards Syria or the Gaza Strip. The Frankop, Montchegorsk and Hansa India, none of which are Iranian-flagged vessels, have all been interdicted whilst at sea with illicit goods and have used and are actually owned by operators which are registered inside of the European Union. So whilst it may be fairly easy to monitor Iranian flagged vessels or vessels directly controlled by IRISL, it's actually quite hard to identify what kind of vessels these are, and especially their containers. You see some of the same kind of problems when it comes to imports from Iran. If you take America as an example, which has some of the strictest sanctions in place against Iran, the main way to get goods to there is third country shipment using various shell companies and third countries. So what you see here is showing that various free zone ports in the United Arab Emirates are being used as much to do with their location as to the fact that they are central transportation hubs to shift illicit goods into Iran. There are various problems to not only identifying vessels, but then actually seizing any contraband on top of it. Freedom of innocent passage and freedom of the seas are central to international maritime law. And whilst the vessel is in transit, it's actually the flag state which has the overall jurisdiction over their own vessel. Iranian flag states which have found themselves subject to searches and bunkering restrictions have as a result tended to flag hop into other open registries. Now, whether this was an unintended consequence of the provisions contained within the Security Council resolutions is open to debate, but without the protection of the Iranian flag, they are more vulnerable to interdiction via such things as mutual boarding agreements. Vessels have also changed names and have registered ownership in the form of shell companies to anywhere in the world, and this is something that's received a lot of media attention, and that really is a very common practice in the shipping industry. So these small shell companies can then actually make it effectively very difficult to establish who the ultimate consignor of a vessel is. Maritime vessels transport some 90% of the world's global trade, and you've got vessels containing literally thousands of containers and ports eager to turn around cargo as quickly as possible, then the dependence on effective military intelligence just about becomes total. So realistically, therefore, even though Iran is subject to one of the most stringent sanctions regimes, in its current format, without this good military intelligence to proactively target and intercept illicit cargo can be very, very, almost nearing on impossible. Having said that, given that, it can be said that the sanctions in their current format are ineffective in reaching their main objective. However, when it comes to measuring the overall effect of sanctions, it's important to bear in mind that any regime, sanctions regime, has also implicit objectives behind it. So such things as sanctions being used to condemn regimes and for norm building to deter other states from acting in a similar way. They can be used as an international isolation tool. So it's been demonstrated how sanctions can be used to perhaps as a precursor to military action, and how evasions of sanctions can be highlighted to point out for the need for either stricter sanctions or for some form of military action. But essentially what they are is a negotiation and diplomacy tool, offering an incentive for a country to alter its behaviour or a disincentive for it to continue with it. In Iran's case, like any other, it's likely that every state pushing for some form of unilateral or multilateral action is motivated by different factors, but it's important to remember these implicit objectives when it comes to measuring overall effectiveness. I'll leave it at that. I hope that's given you a very short introduction. If you would like to find out more about this kind of research, we have a section on the SIPRI website called Transport and Security. I'll just hand you back.